if you look at almost any media right now, the conversation around morning routines is just completely dominated by productivity hacks.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It is everywhere.
Right. You open an app, and you are immediately bombarded with articles. They tell you to drink 30 ounces of lemon water, write down 3 actionable goals, do 10 minutes of zone 2 stretching, and, I don't know, stare at the sun before you ever look at a screen.
Right, right.
And the entire goal is optimization. It is all geared toward turning the human machine into a more efficient corporate asset. But then you look back at history, you look at ancient texts, and you see a completely different paradigm for the morning.
Yes, a totally different mindset.
You see individuals waking up in a landscape that is actively hostile to them. They're not trying to optimize their inbox. They are fighting for their spiritual and physical survival. Welcome to Reform thinking.
It is a massive shift in perspective. I mean, when we read the historical records of how individuals from antiquity started their days, we are stepping into a world where the stakes were life and death, both physically and spiritually.
Which brings us to the specific mission of our conversation today. We are going to intensely analyze one specific morning prayer, Psalm 5. But we are not just reading it on the surface. We are bringing in the heavy artillery. We are using John Peter Lange's massive commentary on the Holy Scriptures.
Yeah, that is a huge resource.
For those who might not know, Lange was a 19th century German theologian who assembled a staggering team of scholars to write one of the most comprehensive, meticulous commentaries ever produced. So we are pulling from the historical, grammatical, and theological analysis of heavyweights.
Biggest names, really.
Yeah, we were talking about John Calvin, Martin Luther, Charles Spurgeon, Matthew Henry, and several others. We wanted to decode the absolute mechanics of how they survived their mornings.
Well, to properly understand what is happening in this text, we have to establish the context immediately. This is not a detached, abstract poem written by someone sitting comfortably in an academic ivory tower drinking tea.
Right. It is not a theoretical exercise.
Not at all. It is a prayer born from a highly specific, high-stakes circumstance. We are looking at the words of a pious individual widely understood to be King David, who is completely surrounded by deceitful adversaries.
Yeah.
He is likely dealing with treason within his own royal court, maybe even the rebellion of his own son, Absalom. So the overarching theme of this text is the sheer mechanics of approaching a sovereign, holy God while trapped amidst human corruption.
That is a heavy burden to wake up to.
It is, and it requires a staggering combination of intense awe and absolute expectation.
If you are listening to this while commuting to a job where you know you are about to face workplace slander or an incredibly hostile boss, or perhaps you are just dealing with intense personal opposition, this ancient text is actually a blueprint.
Yeah, it really is.
It alters how you mentally prepare for that specific environment. So before we look at the theology of who God is, we must first establish how the psalmist approaches him. We see this progression from internal thoughts to external actions.
Right.
Verse 1 starts with, "Give ear to my words, O Lord, consider my meditation." But I know the word meditation there is translated in some versions as sighs or groanings. So what is the distinction between a sigh and the loud cry that he mentions later in the text?
So the Hebrew root for the word translated as meditation or sighs is, well, it's hagig.
Hagig.
Yeah, and it is a fascinating word. It denotes the act of thinking, the internal processing of the mind, but it also literally refers to a low, dull sound.
Like a groan.
Precisely. Think of the muffled, involuntary noise a person makes when they are in physical pain. It is an utterance that has not quite formed into articulate language. It is the groan of the spirit when the burden is too heavy to construct a coherent sentence.
Wow, that paints a picture.
And what Lange points out, relying on rigorous exegesis, which simply means he's drawing the original historical meaning out of the text rather than reading his own modern opinions into it, is that taking this as sighs, or a low sound, provides a brilliant contrast to the loud, vocalized cry that is mentioned just a moment later in verse 3.
So it builds up.
Yes, the progression is entirely organic. It starts with the internal pressure, the dull, groaning sound of a heavily burdened mind. And then it breaks out into an articulate petition.
And I think everyone can relate to that. We all have those mornings where you wake up and the anxiety hits before your feet even touch the floor. You cannot formulate a perfect, grammatically correct paragraph of prayer. You just sigh.
Right. The weight is just too much.
The physical weight of the stress literally pushes a groan out of your chest. But then, as the text shows, he gathers himself. He does formulate a sentence. In verse 2, he addresses God as my king and my God. I want to push back on something here, though. In the ancient world, and even today, God is generally recognized as the ruler of the universe. Why does David specifically say, "my king"? Does that possessive pronoun actually change the legal standing of the prayer?
Oh, it changes everything. That phrase, my king, establishes a very precise theocratic relation.
How so?
As the commentator Hupfeld notes, in the Old Testament, calling God king is not just acknowledging him as a general distant deity. In the ancient Near East, kingship was a specific legal and covenantal relationship defined by strict treaties.
Like a legal contract.
Yes, very much so. When a subject goes to a king, they are appealing for their legal rights. They are asking for protection and justice against adversaries based on a mutual covenant. The king demands loyalty, but the king is absolutely obligated to provide defense. By saying, "my king," the psalmist is invoking that specific covenant. He is essentially saying, I am your sworn subject. I have pledged my loyalty to your crown. Therefore, you are legally and morally responsible for my defense against these traitors. It establishes the grounds for everything he is about to ask.
That makes the approach so much more assertive. He is not begging a stranger for a favor. He is appealing to his sovereign for his legal rights as a citizen of that kingdom.
Exactly.
And that assertiveness really takes shape in verse 3. He says, "My voice shalt thou hear in the morning, O Lord. In the morning will I direct my prayer unto thee, and will look up." The word for direct in Hebrew is arak. This is where the historical context blows my mind. This is not just a casual word for talking, is it?
No, arak is an incredibly precise technical term. In the book of Leviticus, arak is the actual word used for arranging the wood and the pieces of the slaughtered animal on the altar.
Wow, so it is sacrificial language.
Yes, it is used in Leviticus chapter 1 for laying things in order. It is also used for arranging the holy lamps and the showbread in the sanctuary. So when David says, "In the morning I will direct my prayer," he is using the bloody physical language of the priesthood.
That is intense.
He is saying, I am taking my prayer and I am chopping the wood. I am laying out the pieces. I am arranging it on the altar of my heart with meticulous sacrificial care.
Can we pause and talk about what that sacrificial system actually looked like? Because I think modern readers sanitize it. We picture a pristine church service. But the morning sacrifice was brutal physical labor.
It was grueling. The morning sacrifice was one of the very first duties of the priest as soon as the sun came up. It involved slaughtering a massive animal, draining the blood, skinning it, cutting it into specific sections, carrying heavy logs of wood, arranging the fire perfectly so it would burn at the right temperature.
That sounds exhausting.
And then placing the pieces of the animal in a highly specific order dictated by the Levitical law. You could not just throw the meat on the fire carelessly. The preparation was rigorous. The smell, the heat, the physical exhaustion required total mental and physical engagement.
So when David uses the word arak, he is telling us that his morning prayer is not some fleeting, half-asleep thought. He is engaging in rigorous, meticulous preparation of his mind and his words.
Right.
Let me offer a modern comparison. I think a lot of people today treat prayer like throwing a coin into a wishing well. You close your eyes, toss the coin over your shoulder, hear a splash, and walk away. You do not even look to see where the coin landed.
Yeah, that is a great image.
But the psalmist is doing something entirely different. He is taking an arrow, drawing the bowstring back with intense physical exertion, aiming at a highly specific target, releasing the string, and then watching intensely to see where that arrow strikes.
Your arrow analogy is completely aligned with the historical commentary. Matthew Henry actually uses a very similar marksman analogy when he analyzes this text.
Oh, it?
Yeah, but before we get to Henry, we should look at what Charles Spurgeon says regarding this rigorous preparation, specifically contrasting it with the size we talked about earlier.
What does Spurgeon say?
Spurgeon makes a brilliant distinction. He states that words are simply the garments of prayer, while the unuttered longings are the essence. The words dress the prayer, but the sighing, the dull, heavy groaning of the soul, that is the actual substance.
So the words are just the suit.
Yes. If you only have the garments without the essence, you have an empty suit. But when you combine the deep groan of the soul with the meticulous arrangement of the arak, you have a forceful appeal to the sovereign.
I love that quote. Words are just the clothing. We can spend so much time tailoring the suit that we forget to actually put a person inside it.
That is a great way to put it.
You mentioned Matthew Henry. He is famous for his exhaustive commentary on the whole Bible, written back in the early 1700s. What does he pull out of this specific morning routine?
So Matthew Henry breaks this down into 4 specific, actionable commitments drawn directly from verse 3. First, making prayer a deliberate business. Unto thee will I pray. It is not an accident. It is the scheduled labor of the day.
Like a meeting you cannot miss.
Right. You do not just hope you find time for it, you execute it like a vital business meeting. Second, doing it in the morning. Henry notes the necessity of doing this when you are fresh, cleared from the slumbers of the night, and not yet tangled in the chaos of daily affairs.
Makes sense. Get it done early.
Third, keeping a single eye. As Henry says, like a marksman directing his arrow to the center of the target. You are not distracted by a dozen different anxieties. You are focused entirely on the king. And fourth, patiently waiting for an answer. That goes back to the final phrase of the verse, and we'll look up.
Let's analyze that phrase, look up. It implies that the action of praying is not finished when you stop talking.
Exactly. I mean, the commentators point out that looking up is the posture of a sentry standing on a watchtower.
Oh, like looking out for the enemy.
Yes. Or, staying with the sacrificial imagery of the word erak, it is the priest stepping back from the altar, looking up at the sky, and waiting for the fire from heaven to fall and consume the sacrifice. You do not walk away from the altar once the wood is arranged. You wait for the divine response.
That is so active.
The Puritan writer William Gurnall has a remarkably sharp quote on this. He says that praying without expecting an answer is renouncing your confidence and taking God's name in vain.
Wow. Taking God's name in vain, that is a severe accusation. Usually we think of that commandment as just avoiding certain curse words. How does Gurnall connect it to not expecting an answer?
Gurnall argues that if you pray, but you do not watch for the answer, you are essentially mocking the entire process. You are treating the king of the universe like an imaginary friend.
Ouch.
Right. You are proving by your own apathy that you did not actually believe the king was listening in the first place. If you petition a real king for a pardon or for military aid, you do not drop the letter in the mail and then forget about it.
No, you'll be waiting by the door.
You stand at the window watching for the king's messenger to arrive with the royal decree. If you walk away, it proves you thought the exercise was useless. That is taking the name of the king in vain.
So we have this rigorous, meticulous preparation. The wood is laid, the sentry is watching. But that raises a critical question. Why is such intense, careful preparation required? Why cannot the psalmist just speak casually? Why cannot he just roll out of bed and mumble a few words?
That is the big question.
This naturally brings us to the sheer holiness of the God being approached. We have to look at verses 4 through 6, because the psalmist roots his entire confidence in the specific attributes of the sovereign.
The transition in the text is stark. Verse 4 starts with a negative statement. For thou art not a God that have pleasure in wickedness, neither shall evil dwell with thee.
Okay.
The word translated as dwell or be a guest is the Hebrew word gur. This is a loaded term in ancient Near Eastern culture. It denotes someone enjoying the rights of hospitality and protection.
Let's unpack that, because ancient hospitality was very different from having someone over for coffee today.
Oh, it was a matter of life and death. In the ancient Near East, specifically among nomadic Bedouin cultures, the law of the tent was absolute. If a traveler sought refuge in your tent and you took them in as a guest, a girl, you were covenantally bound to protect them.
Bound to protect them.
Yes, you had to feed them, treat them as family, and defend them from their enemies for the duration of their stay, even if it cost you your own life. Once they ate your soul, you were blood-bound to their defense.
That is a massive obligation.
So what the text is declaring here is that evil cannot be a guest in God's house. Evil receives no hospitality, no protection, no salt, and no quarter from the Almighty.
And then verse 5 escalates it. It says, the foolish shall not stand in thy sight. What does it mean to physically stand in his sight?
Hupfeld, another major scholar cited in Lange's commentary, details this beautifully. To stand in the sight of an ancient king is not just about physical proximity. It is a distinct, highly restricted privilege.
Like having access to the Oval Office.
Right. Think of the ancient Persian or Babylonian courts. The king sat on an elevated throne and the room was massive. The vast majority of citizens would never see the king's face. Only the highest nobles, the most trusted viziers, the absolute inner circle were allowed to literally stand in the direct line of sight of the monarch.
And if you just walked in?
To approach uninvited was punishable by death. We see that exact dynamic in the book of Esther. The same language is used in the book of Job regarding the angel standing before God. It is a symbol of intimate relation, favor, and security.
So the foolish are shed out of that.
Yes, the text is stating unequivocally that the foolish, and in biblical terms, the foolish, are not just people lacking intelligence. They are the morally corrupt. The wicked have absolutely no right to stand in that privileged position.
It is a stunning progression. Let's trace the clauses across these three verses because it builds like a storm.
Yes, there is a distinct poetic and theological progression. It moves from passive negative statements to positive, active, and violent judgments.
How does it start?
It starts by saying, God has no pleasure in wickedness. Then evil cannot dwell with him. Then the foolish shall not stand in his sight. Those are the negatives, what God does not allow. But then it shifts to positive, forceful actions. Thou hatest all workers of iniquity. Thou shalt destroy them that speak leasing, which is an archaic word for lying.
Right.
The Lord will abhor the bloody and deceitful man. It escalates from God simply denying access to God actively abhorring and destroying the corrupt.
Okay, let me throw an analogy at you. Think of a monarch's private dining room inside a highly fortified palace. You cannot just wander in off the street, covered in mud and filth from the gutter, pull up a chair, grab a piece of bread, and expect a seat at the table.
No, you definitely
The
can't.
guards would execute you on the spot. Yet, in our modern culture, there is this pervasive idea that God is just a casual buddy, the man upstairs who winks at our flaws, who just wants us to be happy, and who does not really care about the mud we drag onto the royal rugs.
That is a very common view today, yeah.
How should this total, absolute incompatibility between God's burning holiness and human evil reshape a person's daily mindset?
It should completely shatter any sense of casual entitlement. We have domesticated God in the modern era, but the historical commentators did not make that mistake. Stark's commentary handles this with incredible clarity. He points out the frightful reality of human corruption.
What does he say?
Stark states that ungodly men are essentially like wild beasts in human form if they are not restrained by the common grace of God. We often severely underestimate the toxicity of our own rebellion.
Wild beasts in human form. That is a core tenet of Reformation theology, is it not? The idea of total depravity.
Yes.
The concept that human beings left to their own devices are not just basically good people who make occasional mistakes, but are actually fundamentally corrupt and hostile to a holy God.
Correct. John Calvin and Martin Luther both synthesized this concept perfectly in their respective writings on the Psalms. They agree that while we must act with piety and integrity before our fellow men, we must stand in absolute fear and trembling before God.
It is a totally different posture.
Because evil is not just a bookkeeping error, it is an active, treasonous rebellion against the king. That is why those who practice it are entirely frightened away from the place of worship. They cannot endure the penetrating judicial glance of the sovereign. Light and darkness cannot share the same parlor.
I've heard a great quote about that.
As Spurgeon vividly puts it, Christ will not live in the parlor of our hearts if we entertain the devil in the cellar of our thoughts.
Entertain the devil in the cellar of our thoughts. Spurgeon always knows how to land a punch.
He really does.
Oh, wait, I have to push back here.
Yeah.
This creates a massive theological pothole.
Okay, what is it?
If God hates all workers of iniquity, if no one with evil can stand before the king, and we know that all humanity is flawed, including David, who famously committed adultery and murder, how on earth does he dare to enter the sanctuary?
Right.
By his own logic, David should be destroyed by the guards at the door. How does he survive this?
That is the ultimate tension of the text. We are faced with the massive, impenetrable barrier of God's holiness. But that brings us to the solution, which is his mercy. Let's move to verse 7. But as for me, I will come into thy house in the multitude of thy mercy, and in thy fear will I worship toward thy holy temple.
Before we unpack the theology of how David gets in, I know there is a historical controversy surrounding this verse. I have read that some critical scholars argue David could not possibly have written this psalm.
Ah, yes, the dating controversy.
Your argument rests on the words house and holy temple. They point out that the physical temple in Jerusalem was built by David's son, Solomon, years after David died. So if David is talking about walking into a temple, does that not prove he didn't write this? How does Lange get around that chronological pothole?
It is a common objection, but Lange resolves it by looking closely at both linguistic history and biblical theology. Linguistically, the Semitic word bait, which is translated as house, originally just meant a place to spend the night.
So it wasn't necessarily a permanent building.
No, it was a very general, functional term. When the patriarch Jacob slept in the open field using a rock for a pillow and had the vision of the ladder, he woke up and called that patch of dirt Bethel, the house of God. So house does not require a stone building with pillars.
So a tent can be a house.
Yes. Furthermore, regarding the word temple or palace, Lange points out that heaven itself is the true eternal palace of God. The physical tabernacle on earth, the animal skin tent that David actually used, was just a pattern, a small-scale replica of the heavenly reality.
I see.
When Moses built the original tabernacle in the wilderness, God explicitly told him to build it according to the pattern he was shown on the mountain. Because God is the supreme king, any place where his presence uniquely dwells is legitimately called his palace. Even the humble tent David set up in Jerusalem for the Ark of the Covenant could accurately and legally be called the palace or temple of Jehovah.
That makes sense. It is the presence of the king that makes the location a palace, regardless of the building material.
Exactly.
If the King of England sets up a canvas tent in a field and holds court there, that tent is temporarily the royal court.
Yeah.
But let's look at the posture of the psalmist here. He says, I will come into thy house in the multitude of thy mercy. He is not pointing to his own resume.
Not at all. He just spent 3 verses detailing how God hates workers of iniquity and destroys liars. He knows his own history. He knows he cannot enter based on personal merit.
Right.
His entrance is secured entirely by the multitude of God's mercy. It is an overwhelming, abundant, unearned mercy. But notice the pairing: he enters through mercy, but he worships in thy fear. There is a dual nature to this approach.
It is like having an all-access backstage pass provided directly by the venue owner. You didn't buy the ticket. You couldn't afford the ticket. It was handed to you freely by the one in charge of the entire operation.
That is a brilliant way to picture it.
So you don't have to sneak in through the back door. You walk right past the security guards at the front gate because you have the pass. But even though you have bold access, when you step onto that stage and see the massive operation, the blinding lights, the sheer scale of the production, you are still struck with immense awe and respect.
Right, you're not goofing around.
You don't start casually kicking the equipment around. You have access, but you also have intense reverence. Help me analyze that friction. How does a person hold those two things simultaneously, entering boldly because of mercy, yet bowing down in intense fear?
The historical theologians have thought intensely about this paradox. Augustine has a brilliant summation of this dynamic. He writes, he pleases God whom God pleases.
Let me make sure I understand that. He pleases God whom God pleases. So the believer's confidence is not rooted in their own ability to be pleasing, but entirely in the fact that God has sovereignly chosen to be pleased with them.
Precisely. It is the core of grace. You are pleasing to the king because the king decided to look upon you with favor, not because you earned it.
That is a relief.
Another commentator, Frisch, observes that to overcome the enmity of the hostile world outside, a person must first go into the sanctuary, completely humiliate themselves before God, and rely entirely on that grace.
So the fear is appropriate.
Yes, the friction you mentioned is resolved when you realize that the fear of God is not a panic terror of impending damnation. It is a staggering reverence for the purity of the sovereign. You enter the palace boldly because you are clothed in the king's mercy, but you bow down in fear because you know what you would deserve if that clothing were removed.
That brings a massive weight to the morning routine.
Yeah.
You're actively putting on the king's mercy before you face the day. But that is the catch, right? You cannot stay in the sanctuary forever.
No, eventually you have to leave.
If eventually morning prayer ends, you open the door and you have to step right back into the crosshairs of your enemies. You have to walk into a landscape filled with traps. How does this theology survive contact with the real world? Let's look at verses 8 through 10.
The transition in the text is jarring but highly realistic. The psalmist goes from the quiet reverence of the temple right back out into the brutal reality of his enemies. Verse 8 says, Lead me, O Lord, in thy righteousness because of mine enemies. Make thy way straight before my face.
Make thy way straight. What does that imply?
The Hebrew concept of making a way straight or level is crucial here. It does not mean giving the believer an easy, effortless life where they just glide along on a moving walkway without exerting energy.
Okay, so it's not a luxury cruise.
Right. It specifically means removing the unnatural hindrances, the ambushes, the massive stumbling blocks that enemies have placed in the divine path.
I picture a massive snowplow clearing a highway after a blizzard. The snowplow does not drive your car for you. You still have to grip the steering wheel, you still have to press the gas pedal, you still have to pay attention to the ice on the road.
That is an excellent visualization.
But the snowplow removes the impossible barriers. It pushes the 6-foot snowdrifts out of the way so that forward motion is actually possible. If the plow doesn't go first, you are stuck.
Right. The psalmist is asking God to be the vanguard, to clear the traps set by deceitful men so that he can walk in practical righteousness. And the description of these enemies in verse 9 is brutally vivid.
Let's read it.
There is no faithfulness in their mouth. Their inward part is very wickedness. Their throat is an open sepulchre. They flatter with their tongue.
Their throat is an open sepulchre. That is one of the most graphic, unsettling metaphors in the entire biblical text, an open tomb.
It is terrifyingly graphic. The commentator Haldane provides a striking analysis of this specific image. We have to understand ancient burial practices.
They didn't bury people in the ground like we do today, right?
No, in the ancient world, tombs were sealed shut with massive stones, not just to keep grave robbers out, but because of the severe toxic putrefaction taking place inside. A decaying body in the Middle Eastern heat produces an unbearable stench.
Yeah, that is awful to think about.
Haldane points out that just as the foul exhalation leaking out of a cracked tomb proves the severe rotting of the corpse inside, the corrupt, deceitful conversation leaking out of a person's mouth proves the severe moral corruption of their heart.
The words are just the stench.
Yes. The flatteries and the lies are just the stench of spiritual death escaping into the air. What is fascinating is that the Apostle Paul quotes this exact verse in Romans chapter 3 when he is building his grand theological thesis on the universal depravity of all mankind.
So Paul uses David's specific complaint about his enemies to diagnose the entire human race. We all have open tombs in our throats.
I do.
But staying with David's immediate context, we have these enemies breathing out the stench of death, setting traps, flattering with their tongues while plotting destruction. And that leads to verse 10. Which contains what theologians call an imprecatory prayer.
Yes, verse 10 is intense.
Destroy thou them, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Cast them out in the multitude of their transgressions, for they have rebelled against thee. I have to stop and ask the hard question here.
Okay, go ahead.
For the modern listener, how do we deal with this? We are taught by Jesus in the New Testament to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. But here, David is praying for their outright violent destruction. Isn't that a massive contradiction?
This is one of the most debated theological issues in the Psalms. How do we reconcile the command to love our enemies with these prayers for sheer judgment? We need to define what an imprecatory prayer. An imprecation is a spoken curse, a calling down of divine judgment or calamity upon an enemy.
Right.
Stark's commentary tackles this directly and offers a vital distinction to resolve the apparent contradiction. Stark argues that we must differentiate between two very different types of enemies.
What is the first type?
First, there are enemies who persecute us out of ignorance or who simply slander us out of personal grievance or misunderstanding. For them, we are commanded to pray for mercy and conversion, just as Christ did on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Okay, so personal grievances require grace, but what is the second type?
The second type are those who obstinately, willfully, and relentlessly blaspheme known truth. They are not acting out of ignorance. They are acting out of a conscious, hardened hatred for the king and his kingdom. They are trying to overthrow the divine order.
So the prayer for destruction is tied to their unyielding rebellion against God himself, not just a personal grudge David holds because someone insulted him.
Precisely. Look at the very end of verse 10, for they have rebelled against thee. The crime is not that they hurt David's feelings. The crime is high treason against the sovereign of the universe.
It is on a totally different level.
Stark notes that their punishment is not due to a lack of available grace from God, but rather the heavy guilt of their own wanton obstinacy. They have been offered the king's amnesty, and they have spat in the king's face.
And notice the specific mechanism of their downfall in the text. David says, let them fall by their own counsels. He is not asking God to strike them with a random lightning bolt.
No, he is asking God to allow the wicked devices they engineered to be the exact instruments of their own ruin. It is asking for the strict enforcement of divine justice upon those who refuse all offers of divine mercy. The downfall of the wicked is caused by the weight of their own ungodly plans collapsing on top of them.
Like stepping into their own trap.
Exactly. If they dig a pit for the righteous, David is praying that they fall into that exact pit.
That is a crucial distinction. It removes personal vindictiveness from the equation and places the focus entirely on the vindication of God's holy justice. If someone refuses the king's mercy, they are eventually subject to the king's law.
That is the hard truth of it.
But the destruction of the wicked stands in stark contrast to the final fate of those who trust in God. This brings us to verses 11 and 12.
The contrast here is absolute. While the wicked fall by their own counsels, verse 11 says, "But let all those that put their trust in thee rejoice. Let them ever shout for joy, because thou defendest them. Let them also that love thy name be joyful in thee."
And then verse 12.
And then verse 12 provides the foundational guarantee for that joy. "For thou, Lord, wilt bless the righteous. With favor wilt thou compass him as with a shield."
I want to zero in on that word shield. In English, we just hear shield, and we might picture a small piece of wood or metal strapped to a forearm, prop from a medieval movie. But the Hebrew text is much more specific about the military hardware being referenced here, isn't it?
It is incredibly specific. The Hebrew word used here is sinna.
Sinna.
Yes, this is not a small handheld buckler used by a lightly armed soldier to parry sword strikes in hand-to-hand combat. A buckler only protects a small portion of the body at a time. It requires constant movement and reflexes. The sinna is a massive, heavy, full-body shield.
Like how big?
To give you historical context, this is the exact same word used in 1 Samuel to describe the gigantic shield carried by the Philistine champion Goliath.
Oh, wow, so it's massive.
It is a piece of armor so large that it can cover a person entirely, from the top of their helmet to the dust at their feet. When the psalmist says God will compass or surround the believer with favor, as with a sinna, he is describing an impenetrable wall of protection that leaves absolutely no part of the person exposed to enemy fire.
Let me put it this way. Carrying a small buckler is like carrying an umbrella in a severe Category 4 hurricane. You can angle the umbrella against the wind. You might keep your head and shoulders relatively dry for a minute, but your legs are getting soaked, the wind is whipping around you, and you are still highly vulnerable to the elements.
Yeah, an umbrella won't save you in a hurricane.
The sinna is not an umbrella. It is a reinforced concrete bunker. You step inside, the heavy steel door seals tight, and it does not matter how hard the rain falls or the wind howls, you are entirely isolated from the destructive force outside.
That is a fantastic way to grasp it.
How does understanding God's favor as a full-body concrete bunker change a person's reaction to things like workplace slander or personal attacks, which are the modern equivalents of those deceitful tongues we talked about earlier?
It creates a massive psychological shift. The commentator Arndt discusses this vividly. He writes that the righteousness of faith is a mighty protection against both spiritual and bodily enemies. The grace of God functions as both an ornament of royal beauty and an impenetrable military shelter.
So it changes how you react to the slander.
Absolutely. If you truly believe that God's favor is a sinna, a full-body shield, your reaction to slander changes from panic to a sort of quiet defiance. You do not have to frantically run around trying to block every single arrow of gossip or every single lie thrown at you, because you know the shield of the king's favor is absorbing the impact.
This is why the psalmist can command the believer to shout for joy while they are still surrounded by enemies.
Yeah.
They are shouting from behind the sin.
Yes.
The enemies are still shooting, the arrows are still hitting the outside of the wall, but the traps are rendered completely irrelevant by the scale of the defense. The joy is not dependent on the absence of enemies. The joy is dependent on the presence of the shield.
That is the key. And there is another historical commentator, Herberger, who builds on this imagery. He draws out a beautiful theological construct, arguing that God crowns the believer who dwells in this shelter with 4 distinct crowns.
4 crowns. Let's hear them.
First, the crown of grace and mercy, which is the basis of our entry, as we saw back in verse 7. Second, the crown of virtue and piety, which represents the righteous path God clears for us with the snowplow. Third, and this one is surprising, the crown of the cross, or the crown of adversity.
Hold on a second. The crown of adversity. I had to challenge that. That sounds entirely contradictory to the modern ear. We view adversity as a curse. If life is hard, if people are attacking us, we assume God is mad at us. How can adversity be a crown?
It does sound contradictory until you view it through the lens of historical Christian theology, specifically the theology of suffering. The crown of the cross means that God dignifies the believer by allowing them to share in the sufferings of Christ.
Oh, I see.
The adversity, the slander from the open sepulchres, the opposition from the world, these are not signs that God has abandoned the believer. They are signs that the believer is actively engaged in the conflict on the side of the king. Bearing the hostility of the world with patience is a mark of high royal honor.
It's a badge of honor, then.
Yes. It refines the faith, it burns away the impurities, and that leads directly to Herberger's 4th crown, the crown of life, of honor, and of everlasting bliss. The adversity is temporary, but the life is eternal.
Okay, let's pull all of these threads together. We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We started in the quiet, anxious moments of the early morning with a silent, heavy sigh. We watched the meticulous, physical arrangement of the wood for the morning sacrifice of prayer. We confronted the terrifying, burning reality of God's absolute holiness, where no evil can be given hospitality in the tent. We found the backstage pass, the multitude of mercy that allows a flawed person to enter the palace and bow in fear. We looked out at a hostile world filled with traps and the stench of open tombs. And finally, we found absolute security behind the massive, full-bodied Sinna shield.
The sweeping progression of this text is truly remarkable. If we distill the core practical takeaways from all these historical sources, the application for anyone listening is clear and demanding.
What is the main takeaway for the listener?
If you want to receive the grace of God, you must actively use the means of grace God has provided. Do not let your morning prayer be a casual afterthought mumbled into a pillow. Make it a deliberate, expectant action. Arrange the wood, draw the bowstring, and most importantly, stand on the watchtower and look carefully for the answer, fully expecting the sovereign to act on behalf of his covenant subject.
I want to leave everyone with a final thought to chew on today. It builds on everything we have just discussed. We established that God's holiness is so absolute that no one with evil can be a guest in his house. The foolish cannot stand in his sight.
Right.
And yet, we also know that we ourselves are flawed. We carry our own guilt, our own open tombs. But then we have the Sinna shield. We usually think of that massive, full-body shield as something facing outward, protecting us from the attacks of the hostile world.
Yeah, that is the standard view.
But what if that Sinna shield, the favor and imputed righteousness of the king, is not just blocking the arrows of the enemy? What if that massive shield is actually covering your own flaws from the penetrating judicial gaze of the king himself? What if the shield is the only reason you are not consumed by the fire of his holiness, allowing you to stand boldly in the private dining room of the palace as a welcome guest? Keep your eyes fixed on the target of your prayers. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.